The Diary of Elizabeth H. Platt. The account of her journey from New York to Green Bay, Wisconsin in 1836 with her mother, Sarah Esther Henshaw, including a visit among the Winnebago Indian tribes.
Chapter 6. Cleveland to Gambier. On Monday, September 12th, after calling to take leave of our friends the Sargents, Leonards, and Wainwrights, we set off for Gambier and Margaret. Mr. Finch, by our persuasion, having concluded to pursue his original intentions and visit Oberlin and its unique university before his return home. Our locomotive was a large double wagon, uncushioned and uncovered. Our companions were Mr. Williams, formerly of Vermont and now of Gambier, Mr. Sanford, the gentleman who was married by Mr. Bristed in St. Stephen's Church in rather a singular manner, as tradition has it, Mr. Johnson of Gambier, our driver, and a little girl of 12 years old named Kate Spencer. The day was fine and our companions pleasant. Not so the roads. They were sandy and worn by rains, and we toiled along, slowly passing no villages of consequence and very little pleasant scenery. The country during the day's ride was for the most part level, and having gained the summit of almost the only long hill, the eye wandered over an almost unlimited horizon without a single perceptible elevation, a vast amphitheater of seemingly unbroken forest. The view was extensive and novel to my New England eyes, but far less varied and picturesque than the broken and imposing surface of our eastern landscapes. After nightfall, we stopped at the little village of Medina, where we were informed by the Ohioans that we should find superlative fare and accommodations, but to our sorrow we learned that what is luxury in this western world would be termed scarcely comfort in New England. The supper was cold and badly served, and our beds unclean and animated by intrusive visitors. After a sleepless night, we entered our vehicle, Mother complaining of aching bones, and bent our course still southerly. We rode about 7 miles to breakfast and alighted at an inn whose aspect, although less costly, was far cleaner than that at Medina. Our breakfast was edible. The bread and butter were both good, and the food generally looked wholesome. We purchased some cookies of the landlady by way of luncheon, to which Mother added a paper full of cheese. Our road today was a continued alternation of uphill and downhill, although smoother and less broken than we had traversed yesterday. We passed some orchards laden with peaches, whose ruddy cheeks looked tempting as the fabled fruit of the Hesperides. Our gentlemen endeavored to procure some, that we might not suffer all the pains of Tantalus, but alas, all is not gold that glistens. They were fair and tempting in the outward semblance, but unripe and hard as the heart of the Egyptian monarch. Our horse had become quite lame from traveling, in consequence of a kick most unkindly bestowed by his boon companion, and at Worcester, a comely town of about 1,000 inhabitants, he became so disabled as to be disqualified from proceeding on his journey. We were detained until 4:00 p.m., endeavoring to obtain a substitute, and we then pursued our way, hoping to reach the Great Prairie, a distance of about 8 miles before nightfall. We had parted from Mr. Sanford at Medina, and our party now consisted of but 5, inclusive of little Kate, who adhered most affectionately to Mr. Williams. They were on the back seat, Mother and myself on the middle with cloaks, and when we could spare them from our shoulders, our shawls as cushions, and Mr. Johnson, our accommodating and careful driver, in front of us. When we were within 4 miles of our destination for the night, the heavens grew black, and thunder roared, the lightning flashed, and the clouds poured out their water, not with the light and gentle showers which fall softly and lovingly upon the earth, drawing forth its sweetness and giving to its complexion a brighter tint, like tears upon the cheek of beauty, nor yet did it come in the bright round drops dancing upon the rivulets, cheerily and mirthfully lending poetry and life to the scene. But it came in dense sheets of water, as if the cloud had been rent asunder and discharged its contents in one effort. Umbrellas were of small avail to save us from the inundation. We rode on, dripping with wet, and drew up to the first house that presented itself. It was now almost dark. The man came to the door, and we asked for shelter. He gave an unintelligible reply, but the case admitted not of parley, and we sprung from the wagon and ran in. Mother was longer in descending. The poor old lady tried first one foot and then the other, climbed half over the side of the unwieldy and cumbrous vehicle, and then climbed back again, but all to no effect. Her form was not pliant enough to enable her to descend in safety. She seated herself again in despair to take the pelting of the pitiless storm. But our gallants could not leave her thus. They drew up to the side of the fence, from whence protruded a sort of water trough, and there by the aid of their muscular forms, a good deal of effort, and much patience, she worried her way down and came in. The mansion was a great shell of a thing, peopled by Germans who could neither understand us or we them. Seats they had not, and we were obliged to keep our feet. Fire there was none of any consequence, and our wet clothes must of necessity remain wet. We asked them for lodging, but they grumbled out that they had no bedding, and to our proposal to sleep on the floor they gave no indication of assent. The man said that at the distance of 1.5 miles we should find accommodation, as a neighbor of his had invited him to send all such benighted and storm-taken travelers to him. So as there seemed no alternative, we clambered into the wagon in our wet garments to pursue our disheartening journey. I pressed $0.25 into the hands of the fat old German woman, a language which I thought she would understand more readily than my English. She declined receiving it, perhaps conscience-smitten for her inhospitality, but I persisted in the hope it might encourage her to greater charity another time, and we departed wishing them a courteous good night. Darkness increased upon us, and the storm, which had abated a little, returned with an accumulated force, but we drove on and on. Nothing like a habitation was in sight. At length, after traversing at least 2 miles of earth, we spied a glimmering light. It came from a log cabin of small dimensions, but 1 story high. This, however, was doubtless the house of entertainment spoken of, and Mr. Williams, with faint courage, groped his way in to ask if we could be accommodated. A voice issued from the house as if elated with some new feeling. "Yes, yes, I'll bring ye a light." A glimmering, feeble light was held up at the door, and a stout, able-bodied man made his appearance and came with a cheerful but foreign accent to aid us in alighting. He lifted me to the ground, and on hearing Mother's exclamations of despair at the almost hopeless prospect of endeavoring to get her ponderosity again from the vehicle, he spoke out cheerfully. "Oh, I can lift ye." "Not me," said Mother. "I am very heavy." "I lift my woman out," replied the German, for he was of that nation, "and she weighs nigh about 200. At all events, by the aid of a chair and his stalwart arm, Mother descended on terra firma. We climbed by means of a board over the fence, for gate there was none, and entered the cabin. The single room was lighted by the lamp of which I spoke, suspended to a nail in the wall. I thought from its size and shape it was an iron padlock, with lard and wick played in the keyhole, but I was afterwards informed it was a bona fide lamp of a kind used by the Germans. The room contained 2 beds, on one of which lay 2 children, a loom, a spinning wheel, a cradle with an infant in it, a table, and at which sat an immense woman eating her supper, which consisted of bread and hard yellow corn in the ear. She had recently burned her foot very badly and was now a cripple in consequence of it. Beside the chair she occupied, the room contained 2 others. A little deformed girl of about 12 years made up the number of inmates to this promising abode. A tolerable fire, however, burned and sparkled within the immense fireplace, and the voice of a cheerful hospitality welcomed our approach to it. We informed them in the outset that we were dripping wet and very hungry, and should give them a great deal of trouble, and, moreover, said I, if your wife is lame, I see not how you will get along with it. "It matters not," replied the good-natured German. "What she cannot do, I can. I have had some thoughts of putting up my sign and keeping tavern." We smiled as we glanced around his facilities for doing so, and from his exceeding gladness to see us, I almost fancied some dark motive, and tales of banditti, robbery, and bloodshed came creepingly over my imagination. The first thing was to get warmed and dried, so our host made a rousing fire. Trunks, box, and baskets, bonnet, shawls, and cloaks were placed before it. The gentlemen took off their coats, and Mother and myself, impelled by necessity, retired behind a sheet which was suspended at the foot of the farther bed, and hung within about 2 feet of the floor, and there despoiled ourselves of our outer garments and supplied them with nightgowns. I found myself wet through and therefore had to take advantage of the occasional retreat of the gentleman from the fire and dry myself more substantially and internally. The old lady hobbled about to make us tea, while the young girl and the old man spread the table with an immense loaf of bread, a piece of butter, cups and saucers, plates, and a half-dozen preserved plums. For all these things, or rather for the eatables, they had to go outdoors in the rain. We asked for boiled eggs and were told we could have a few. The water to boil for the tea was put over the fire in a small dish kettle. The tea was drawn in a teapot. However, Mother said it was hot and good. I drank a glass, or rather a cup of milk, and anticipated making my supper of eggs, which I intended to eat from my saucer. But when the old lady came to pour out the tea, I found that when she had helped them to sugar, she passed a spoon around for them to stir it with, and the house contained but two, one large and one small, and both of iron. Thus vanished all my hopes of eating my eggs in that way, so I broke them upon my plate, cut up my bread in them, and ate them with my knife and fork. After supper we thought of sleep. The good hostess asked if we would like a blanket or bed quilt over us. We chose the latter. She prepared our bed behind the sheet, and then the man of the house remarked that he was usually in the habit of having evening prayer before retiring, and as we had said grace at supper, he presumed it would not be unpleasant to our gentlemen to offer it. Thus invited, Mr. Williams commended us all to the care of Him who never sleeps, in the beautiful language of our liturgy, and we then prepared for bed. A closet door was opened at the side of the house, which had escaped my notice, and the gentlemen ascended by a small ladder to an upper loft. Kate Spencer was placed across the foot of our bed, Mother turned in the backside, and after further hospitalities offered from the good man and wife, which were more extreme than I had ever met with, I threw my head upon a pillow, which from its fragrance I should suppose stuffed with herbs, and my feet in a chair, and endeavored to sleep. Beneath us was a coarse twilled blanket, and above us our only covering was the bed quilt which we had chosen. Sheets were out of the question. I had retained all my garments, but as the night advanced I waxed warm, and thrown in upon such a heap, and first came off overshoes, then shoes, stockings, petticoats, etc., until I was in my usual night gear. I tossed and tumbled all night, but soft nature's sweet restorer would not be wooed in such an uncourtly place. The man and his wife snoring on our left hand, the child crying in the cradle, and the moaning of the elements without. Before the day had fairly dawned, a man entered the dwelling without let or hindrance. Said he, "I'm going to muster. Have you any biscuit for me?" "Yes," said the good wife. "Ye will find him in that box close by the other bed." It was the box on which I had laid my clothes when I disburthened myself in the night. I hastily drew them off ere he approached. The box, however, was piled full of bedclothes and other materials, which he begged permission to pile onto me, and so there I lay beneath a load of rubbish until he had helped himself to his bread, gone off, and I could crawl out and disabuse myself of them. The gentleman soon appeared, and we were obliged to robe as we had disrobed behind the scanty screen. As soon as we were arrayed, we took leave of our hospitable entertainers, and when seated in the wagon once more and fairly out of sight and sound, amused ourselves heartily at our night's entertainment and adventure. It was worth the endurance for the sake of the knowledge it brought us of the habits and manners of our race, and to teach us rightly to estimate our own blessings and privileges. A succession of hills, steep as the Green Mountains and far more wearisome, because they present not that wilderness and grandeur of scenery and occasional rains, were our lot in this day's journeyings. We toiled up and down the former, and met the latter as meekly and patiently as we could. Our horses were fatigued, and the way seemed to lengthen before us. Occasionally a fine forest scene would break upon us, where the trees, free from underbrush and saplings, grew straightly and singly upward, of vast magnitude, grouped together in imposing majesty, and interlacing their verdant boughs in the form of Gothic arches, and presenting long vistas through which the eye might roam, as though a vast temple consecrated to nature, with her pillared aisles and lofty arches, sculptured and wreathen by the hands of deity, and surmounted by a dome, inlaid with heaven's own azure. The corn in this state grows to an exceeding height. It is said that a man 6 feet high could not reach to hang his hat upon it. This was accounted for by the fact that it is a peculiar kind of corn, of a very large kind, and which in strong soil shoots up in amazing vigor. The distance from Cleveland to Gambier is but about 90 miles, yet night overtook us on this third day of our journey before we reached our destination. We passed through the small and dirty villages of Loudonsville and Amity, and soon found ourselves in the forest encircling Gambier. Here the road had been newly made, and we toiled over stumps, passed around fallen trees, forded brooks, and surmounted many obstacles, when darkness drew her heavy curtain around us, and we were still in the wilderness. "Hi-ho!" groaned my mother. "Oh, hi-ho!" echoed I. "This is indeed the land of sighs." We lost our way twice, and were obliged to back our horses and make an untrodden path through the bushes to recover it, and thus moment after moment passed, and every time we inquired the distance, miles were given us in reply instead of rods. At length, Mr. Williams, we are now upon college grounds. Still no light burst upon us, and the gloomy forest was still overheard, through which the occasional rain fell dismally upon us. "This is my farm," said Mr. Williams. Still we rode on, and it seemed as if the way would never terminate. Darkness overshadowed all our path. "This is Mr. Wing's farm," rejoined Mr. Williams. "And how far is it from the college?" asked my mother, in as smooth a voice as the stumps, stones, and her anxieties would permit. "Not more than a mile," was the reply. "A mile?" she almost shrieked. But time and patience brought us at length to the wished-for haven, a solitary light now and then twinkling through the trees. We came to Mr. Williams' house. He alighted at our desire, and took Catherine Spencer with him, and we proceeded about a half a mile further to a light that shone faintly in the distance, rode under the branches of a forest of trees, and embowered in their foliage came full upon the blaze of some 2 or 3 lamps in Sister Margaret's house, and one held by her dear self at the door to welcome us. The noise of the wheels had announced us to her expecting heart, and Julia Fitch was already at the wagon to aid us in alighting. We went into the embrace of our sister, while Mr. Johnson took our luggage into the house. The children came down from their chambers in almost a state of nudity to welcome us. Here were Daniel and Joshua Whitney, and the little Francis. We were taken to the warm kitchen fire, treated to a bowl of peaches and cream, and after a short conversation were permitted to repose our wearied limbs upon a soft and comfortable bed, with none to molest or make us afraid. We spent 3 weeks and 3 days in this pretty retreat. Gambier, named after Lord Gambier, is built upon a hill about 2 miles in circumference. The college lands comprise 4,000 acres. There is Kenyon College, named after an English lord of that name. It is a massy stone edifice of the Gothic style, built with 2 wings, Gothic spires, and turreted chimneys. Ross Chapel, named after Lady Ross, who handsomely endowed it, is a large Grecian building where the students meet for prayer and where divine service is held on the Lord's Day. The theological seminary, to be named Bexley Hall after Lord Bexley, is not yet commenced, although its site is chosen. Beside these public buildings there is Milner Hall, a brick edifice with wings, and named in honor of Dr. Milner of New York, whose church has contributed $11,000 at various times to the different institutions in Gambier connected with Kenyon College. The bishop has a large and beautiful residence here. Mr. Sparrow, vice president of the college, has also a handsome dwelling, surrounded by trees, the native growth of the soil, and there are houses and grounds in different form of taste and beauty for the 4 professors, Muncher, Kendrick, and Fitch, besides those of 2 merchants and various teachers, artisans, etc. The society is small, but select and very agreeable. While at Gambier, we took tea twice with Mrs. Kendrick and once with Mrs. Muncher, and received calls and invitations from most of the inhabitants. Mrs. Bosch, the wife of Dr. Bosch, and her daughter, Miss Rosa Cambridge, rank high among the elite in beauty of the village. The former has gone on to visit to her sister in Philadelphia, after treating us with a very courteous call, and the latter we had the pleasure of seeing and hearing several times. Soon after we arrived at Gambier, and before Mr. Fitch's return from Oberlin, I rode with Margaret, the boys, and Hester Gunn, the little servant girl, about 2.5 miles from town, on the road to Vernon, and spent the day with the French family, a Mr. Torode, in a log cabin, where we were very kindly and hospitably entertained with fricasseed chicken, figs, and as many fine peaches as we could eat and carry home. Mrs. Smith, a lovely, interesting woman, came and spent an afternoon with us when we had been there about a week. I felt much attracted towards her because I heard Sister Margaret often speak of her piety and the kind feelings which she had manifested for me in my season of heaviest affliction and bereavement. The evening was delicious. The soft moon looked out from the sapphire palace with unwonted loveliness, and we were enticed out to wander among her beams and gaze upon her bewildering brightness. The dew upon the grasses and fences lay in large drops like a heavy rain, and we found it was a kind of distilled poison, and the more deadly in proportion to the brightness of the skies from which it came. The next day I felt it in my system, and on the second day I was obliged to go to bed with bilious symptoms. I took early remedial measure and recovered from it in a few days, with the loss of a fine sermon from Dr. Sparrow, which was preached on Sunday during my indisposition. This I exceedingly regretted, as I am told he is a man of a master mind. I made an excursion on horseback with Brother Chauncey, 2 miles, to a Mr. Liebarger's, a German, to procure peaches. We found the family very hospitable. I walked out into the orchard with a niece of the old lady, and she catechized me with a world of questions. "I suppose you live a piece from here?" "Yes, 700 miles. "Why do you expect to go back soon?" "Not till I have traveled 700 miles further." Her eyes were opened wide with wonder. "Is your father living?" "No." "And your sisters?" "They are all married. Mother and myself were left alone together, and we thought we would visit them." "And are you the youngest, I suppose?" "No, but the only single one." The good people filled a bag with apples, peaches, and squashes, and flung it over Chauncey's saddle, then filled a basket with peaches and put it on his arm, and thus finished, we set out on our return to Gambier, followed by a colt who had been the steady attendant and filiant follower of my Rosinante. We jogged slowly on, the river was forded, and our path about halfway trodden, when Chauncey's horse startled, the colt after her, the string of the bag broken, and down rolled the squashes, apples, and peaches into the street. He checked his horse, gave it in charge to me while he alighted to pick up his plunder, and left me with the 2 horses and colt 3 abreast, as interesting and poetic as the dragons guarding the golden fruit. On Saturday, a week before our final departure from Gambier, Sister Harriet and her Henry arrived to our great joy on their way to a warmer climate. We could not but smile with inward satisfaction at the way in which things come about, and the strangeness of the providence which brought 4 of us together so lovingly in this distant land. Who would have thought that 1 little year ago, when we were convened in a different place for a different purpose, that such a thing could be? A week fled past lightly and gaily, and many a Henshaw laugh rang out clearly and merrily among the forest of Ohio. Oh, how these sunbeams of social endearment and sisterly affection break through the dark clouds of our separation. How sweet will be that celestial clime where the sunbeam will be perpetual and the circle unbroken. Excerpt from the poem The Forsaken Hearth by Felicia Hemans. Even here 'tis not a broken chain, thy memory binds them still, thou holy hearth of other days, though silent now and chill. The smiles, the tears, the rite beheld by thine attesting stone have yet a living power to mark thy children for thine own. The mother's voice, the father's prayer, though called from earth away, with music ringing from the dead, their spirits yet shall sway, and by the past and by the grave the parted yet are one. Though the loved hearth be desolate, the bright fire quenched and gone. In our communings together, we mused much of the past, the present, and the future. We rejoiced in the present happiness of the dear sister with whom we were sojourning, that she had so kind a husband, so sweet a child, so good a house, so pleasant and comfortable a home. Mother thought of it with great satisfaction, and I have no doubt that it will be a drop of nectar in the cup of her remaining life. Harriet was ill for 2 or 3 days in Gambier, but her careful spouse called in the doctor, and she was soon able to be downstairs, but she still looked thin and did not seem the Hebe-faced Harriet of our hardy clime. We parted from them sorrowfully, but yet carrying with us the sweet remembrance that in this wide earth we had once more met, and our voices and hearts taken sweet counsel together. They all went with us to Vernon, where we were to separate, and Mother and myself pursue our solitary way to Huron by night. Harriet and her husband were to remain at Gambier until Monday the 20th of October. It disturbed me much that we were to travel on the Lord's Day, but there seemed to be no alternative. We received a letter from Emmeline on Thursday evening, appraising us of the necessity of meeting her at Huron by the 11th of October. The stage only traveled on that route every alternate day, and we must therefore of necessity leave on Saturday evening and travel all day on Sunday, or run the hazard of being too late for the boat.
End of chapter 6.